The year was 1847, and the Nebraska Territory was a place where survival meant everything. Out here on the frontier, the nearest neighbor could be 20 miles away, and help was even further. This was where 12-year-old Samuel Henderson called home. Living in a small log cabin with his parents and younger sister on land that stretched as far as the eye could see, Samuel's father, Thomas, was a fur trader who had built their homestead near a winding creek that never seemed to run dry. The water was crystal clear and cold, flowing down from the distant mountains, and it served as a lifeline for everyone in the area. Both settlers and the local Lakota people knew about this creek, and Thomas had been smart enough to choose this spot for exactly that reason. Water meant life, and life meant business. The winter of 1847 was unlike anything the Henderson family had ever experienced. The cold came early that year, settling in like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. By December, the temperatures had dropped so low that the creek began forming thick layers of ice along its edges. Snow piled up against their cabin walls, sometimes reaching the windows. The wind howled day and night, finding every tiny crack in their home and reminding them just how small they were against nature's power, Samuel's most treasured possession. During these harsh months was a blanket his grandmother had made for him before she passed away 2 years earlier. It wasn't just any blanket. Grandma Henderson had spent months working on it, using the finest wool she could find and weaving it with patterns that told stories. There were geometric designs that looked like mountains and valleys, swirling lines that reminded you of flowing water, and colors that seemed to capture the essence of autumn leaves. The blanket was thick and warm, with a weight that felt like a gentle hug every time Samuel pulled it around his shoulders. His grandmother had given it to him on his 10th birthday, just months before she became ill. She had placed it in his hands with tears in her eyes and told him, "This blanket will keep you warm when I cannot, my dear boy. But remember, true warmth comes from the kindness we show others." At the time, Samuel hadn't fully understood what she meant, but he treasured her words as much as the blanket itself. The Lakota people were a constant presence in their area, though not always a visible one. Samuel would sometimes catch glimpses of them in the distance, riding their horses across the vast plains or stopping by the creek to water their animals. His father had taught him and his sister to respect these people and their ways. Thomas Henderson was different from many other settlers who had come west. He didn't see the Lakota as enemies or obstacles to be removed. Instead, he viewed them as neighbors who had been living on this land long before any white families arrived. "They know this land better than we ever will," Thomas would tell his children around the dinner table. "They understand the seasons, the animals, and the ways of survival that we're still learning. If we're smart, we'll treat them with the same respect we'd want for ourselves." This philosophy had served the Henderson family well. There had been a few occasions when Lakota warriors had stopped by their homestead, and each time Thomas had greeted them with courtesy and offered what hospitality he could. He had learned a few words in their language and always tried to communicate with respect. In return, the Lakota had never caused trouble for the Henderson family, and there had even been times when they had left small gifts, perhaps a freshly caught fish or information about approaching storms. Samuel's mother, Mary, was initially more nervous about their Native American neighbors than her husband was. She had heard frightening stories from other settler women about raids and conflicts, and the uncertainty made her anxious. But as time passed and she witnessed the respectful interactions between Thomas and the Lakota people who occasionally visited, she began to relax. She even started learning how to prepare certain foods that the Lakota enjoyed, thinking it might be a nice gesture if they ever had visitors. 10-year-old Elizabeth, Samuel's younger sister, was naturally curious about everything, including their mysterious neighbors. She would pepper her parents and Samuel with questions about the Lakota people, what they ate, where they lived, why they painted their faces sometimes, and whether their children played the same games she did. Samuel found himself becoming something of an expert on what little he knew, sharing stories his father had told him about Lakota customs and beliefs. Life on the frontier required everyone in the family to contribute, even the children. Samuel's responsibilities included feeding their few animals, chopping wood for the fireplace and helping his father with various tasks around the homestead. During the brutal winter months, these chores became even more challenging. The water. Buckets would freeze solid overnight, requiring Samuel to break the ice each morning. The animals needed extra care and attention to survive the cold, and finding enough firewood became a daily struggle. Despite the hardships, there was something beautiful about their isolated life. On clear nights, the stars seemed close enough to touch, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The silence was profound, not the absence of sound, but a deep, peaceful quiet that city folks never experienced. Samuel loved these moments, often standing outside their cabin wrapped in his grandmother's blanket, just listening to the world around him. The nearest town was a 2-day ride away, which meant the Henderson family had to be completely self-sufficient for months at a time. Mary had become expert at preserving food, and their root cellar was filled with vegetables, salted meat, and other supplies to last through the long winter. Thomas had built their cabin to withstand the harsh weather, with thick walls and a sturdy roof that could handle heavy snow loads, but even with all their preparations, the winter of 1847 tested them in ways they hadn't expected. The cold was so severe that their carefully planned supplies seemed to disappear faster than anticipated. The animals required more feed to stay warm, which meant their stores were running lower than Thomas liked. Ice formed on the inside of their windows, and they had to keep the fire burning constantly to prevent the cabin from becoming dangerously cold. Samuel noticed how the extreme weather affected everything around them. The usual wildlife seemed to have disappeared, probably seeking shelter in caves or other protected areas. Even the birds that normally stayed through winter had apparently decided this year was too harsh. The landscape looked like something from a fairy tale, but a dark one where everything was frozen and still. It was during this particularly brutal stretch of winter that Samuel would encounter something that would change his life forever. The kindness his grandmother had spoken about, the respect his father had taught him, and the curiosity his family had encouraged would all come together in a moment that would test everything he believed about right and wrong, about helping others, and about the true meaning of sacrifice. The stage was set for an event that would echo through the years, becoming a story passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of human kindness can have the most profound consequences, reaching far beyond anything we might imagine when we make the choice to simply do what feels right in our hearts. The morning started like any other brutal February day in 1847. Samuel woke to the sound of wind rattling their cabin walls and the familiar sight of frost covering the inside of their small window. His breath came out in visible puffs as he pulled his grandmother's blanket tighter around his shoulders and reluctantly left the warmth of his bed to start his daily chores. The cold hit him like a physical blow when he stepped outside. The air was so frigid it seemed to burn his lungs with each breath. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, adding another layer to the already deep drifts that surrounded their homestead. Samuel pulled his wool cap down over his ears and wrapped a scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed as he trudged toward the barn to check on their animals. Their cow, Bessie, and the 2 horses they owned were huddled together for warmth in the barn. Samuel could see their breath steaming in the cold air, and he quickly went about filling their water troughs, breaking the thin layer of ice that had formed overnight. The animals seemed grateful for his attention, and Bessie even gave him what he liked to think was a thankful look as he provided fresh hay. It was while he was carrying water from the creek that Samuel first noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it might be a pile of old clothes or perhaps some debris that had blown against the side of their barn during the night's storm. But as he got closer, his heart nearly stopped. It wasn't debris at all. It was a person, a young girl, probably around 10 years old, lay crumpled in the snow near the barn wall. She was clearly Native American, wearing traditional clothing that was beautiful but completely inadequate for the savage cold they were experiencing. Her long black hair was tangled and filled with ice crystals, and her dark skin had taken on a frightening bluish tint that Samuel instinctively knew was a very bad sign. What made the scene even more heartbreaking was the horse lying nearby. The poor animal had clearly collapsed from exhaustion and cold, its once proud body now still and covered with a light dusting of snow. Samuel realized that this girl had been traveling, probably trying to reach her family or her village. When the terrible weather had overcome both her and her faithful horse, Samuel dropped the water bucket and rushed to the girl's side. She was barely breathing, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow movements. Her eyes were closed, and when he gently touched her forehead, he could feel intense heat radiating from her skin despite the freezing temperature around them. She was burning up with fever while simultaneously freezing to death, a combination that Samuel knew could be fatal without even thinking about it. Samuel began unwrapping his grandmother's precious blanket from around his own shoulders. The cold immediately bit into him, but he ignored it as he carefully lifted the girl and wrapped her in the thick, warm wool. She was so light, so fragile, that he was afraid he might hurt her just by moving her. But he knew he had to get her out of the wind and snow immediately. Carrying her was more difficult than he had expected. Samuel was strong for his age, but the girl was completely limp, and the deep snow made every step a struggle. By the time he reached the barn door, he was breathing heavily, and his exposed skin was already starting to ache from the cold. But he pressed on, determined to help this stranger who had somehow found her way to their homestead. Inside the barn, Samuel quickly created a makeshift shelter in one of the empty horse stalls. He gathered every piece of cloth, old blanket, and hay he could find, building a nest-like area that would protect the girl from drafts while keeping her as warm as possible. The barn wasn't heated, but it was much warmer than being outside in the open wind, and the body heat from their animals helped raise the temperature slightly. As Samuel worked, he kept glancing at the girl, worried that she might stop breathing altogether. Her face was so peaceful, almost like she was simply sleeping, but he could see how sick she was. Her lips had a blue tinge, and occasionally she would shiver violently, even wrapped in his grandmother's blanket. He realized she needed more than just warmth. She needed water, food, and probably medicine that his family didn't have. Once he had made her as comfortable as possible, Samuel ran back to the cabin to get his parents. His mother, Mary, was preparing breakfast when he burst through the door, his face red from cold and excitement. His father, Thomas, was sitting at their small table, planning the day's work. When Samuel breathlessly explained what he had discovered, both parents immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. They had heard stories of people freezing to death in weather like this, and they knew that every minute could make the difference between life and death for the young girl. Mary quickly gathered some warm broth she had been preparing, along with clean cloths and their few medical supplies. Thomas grabbed additional blankets and followed Samuel back to the barn. When Thomas first saw the girl, his expression grew very serious. He had enough experience with frontier life to recognize how close to death she was. But he also saw something else: the way Samuel had carefully arranged everything to keep her warm and safe, and the fact that his son's most prized possession was now wrapped around a complete stranger. "You did the right thing, son," Thomas said quietly, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Your grandmother would be proud of the way you're using her gift." The next few hours became a blur of activity. Mary tried to get small sips of warm broth into the girl's mouth, though most of it just ran down her chin. They took turns sitting with her, monitoring her breathing and trying to keep her temperature stable. Thomas even brought in a small brazier with burning coals to warm the immediate area around her, though they had to be careful not to create a fire hazard in the barn. Samuel refused to leave her side for more than a few minutes at a time. He had appointed himself as her guardian, and he took the responsibility seriously. He talked to her even though she couldn't respond, telling her about his family, their homestead, and promising that they would take care of her until she got better. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but it felt important to let her know she wasn't alone. As the day progressed, the girl's condition seemed to stabilize somewhat. Her breathing became a little less labored, and the dangerous blue color began to fade from her skin. But she remained unconscious, lost in whatever fevered dreams were occupying her mind. Samuel continued his vigil, wrapped in an old horse blanket since his good one was still keeping the mysterious girl warm. that evening. As the family gathered around their dinner table, the conversation inevitably turned to their unexpected guest. They didn't know her name, where she had come from, or how long she had been traveling in the deadly cold. What they did know was that she was someone's daughter, someone's little girl, and that she needed their help to survive. The second day brought no improvement. If anything, the young girl seemed to be getting worse. Samuel had barely slept, checking on her every few hours throughout the night. Each time he crept into the barn with a small lantern, he feared he might find that she had stopped breathing altogether. But somehow, she kept fighting, her small chest continuing to rise and fall beneath his grandmother's blanket. Samuel's parents were growing increasingly worried, not just about the girl's condition, but about what her presence might mean for their family. They had no way of knowing who she was or where she had come from, and in the tense atmosphere of the frontier, misunderstandings could quickly turn deadly. But looking at their son's determined face as he cared for the stranger, they knew they couldn't ask him to stop. "She's just a child," Mary whispered to her husband that morning as they watched Samuel carefully trying to get the girl to drink some warm milk. "How could anyone expect us to turn away a dying child?" Thomas nodded, though his expression remained troubled. He had seen enough of frontier life to know that good intentions didn't always lead to good outcomes. Still, he was proud of his son's compassion, and he wasn't about to teach Samuel that kindness was something to be ashamed of. By the afternoon of the second day, the girl's fever had gotten so high that she began talking in her sleep. She spoke in her native language, words that none of the Henderson family could understand, but the tone was clear enough. Sometimes she seemed to be calling out for someone, her voice rising with distress. Other times she whispered so quietly that Samuel had to lean close just to hear that she was speaking at all. Samuel found himself wishing desperately that he could understand what she was trying to say. Was she calling for her mother, her father? Was she in pain, or was she dreaming of home? He began talking back to her in English, his voice gentle and reassuring, hoping that somehow the tone of kindness would reach her even if the words didn't. "Makes sense. It's okay," he would tell her. "You're safe now. My family and I are taking care of you. You just need to get better, and then we'll help you find your way home." On the morning of the third day, something changed. Samuel arrived at the barn to find the girl's eyes open for the first time. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with confusion and fear. When she saw Samuel approaching, she tried to sit up, but she was far too weak. The effort caused her to start coughing, and Samuel could see how much it hurt her. "Easy," Samuel said softly, the same tone he used when calming a frightened animal. "Don't try to move too fast. You've been very sick." The girl stared at him, clearly trying to understand where she was and what had happened to her. Her eyes moved around the barn, taking in the horses, the familiar smell of hay and animals, and finally settling back on Samuel's face. He could see the moment when she realized that his grandmother's blanket was wrapped around her. With great effort, she lifted one thin hand and touched the blanket, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns his grandmother had woven. She looked back at Samuel with a question in her eyes, and though they couldn't speak the same language, he understood what she was asking. "It's yours now," Samuel said simply. "You need it more than I do." Even though she couldn't understand his words, something in his tone seemed to reach her. For the first time since he had found her, Samuel saw the ghost of a smile cross her face. It was weak and lasted only a moment, but it was there. Over the next few hours, the girl drifted in and out of consciousness, but during her waking moments, she began to try to communicate. She would point to herself and say what Samuel assumed was her name, though he couldn't quite pronounce the sounds she was making. In return, he pointed to himself and said, "Samuel," which she tried to repeat with limited success. Despite the language barrier, they began to understand each other in small ways. When she was thirsty, she would make a gesture toward her mouth. When she was cold, she would pull the blanket tighter around herself. And when Samuel would get up to leave, even for just a few minutes, she would look at him with such panic that he learned to tell her he was coming back, using gestures and a reassuring tone. Samuel's mother began bringing meals, to the barn so that her son could eat while staying close to the girl. Mary had to admit that she was impressed by the young stranger's quiet bravery. Even though she was clearly terrified and probably in pain, she never complained or cried. She accepted the Henderson family's care with a dignity that seemed far beyond her years. Thomas spent some time studying the girl's clothing and the few possessions that had been with her. When Samuel found her, her dress was beautifully made with intricate beadwork that suggested she came from a family of some importance. Her small moccasins were crafted with exceptional skill, and she wore a necklace that looked like it had been made by someone who truly loved her. "She's not just any child," Thomas told his wife quietly. "Someone is probably looking for her, and they're probably very worried." As the third day progressed, it became clear that despite everyone's best efforts, the girl was losing her fight. Her fever had broken, but she seemed to be getting weaker rather than stronger. She slept most of the time now, and when she was awake, she seemed to be looking at something far away, as if she could see things that others couldn't. That evening, as Samuel sat beside her holding her small hand, she squeezed his fingers with what little strength she had left. She turned her head to look directly at him, and in her eyes he could see that she knew she was dying. But instead of fear, there was something else there. Gratitude. She whispered something in her own language, a phrase that she repeated several times with great effort. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She was thanking him. This little girl, who was facing death so far from home, was using some of her last strength to thank a stranger who had shown her kindness. Samuel felt tears running down his cheeks as he squeezed her hand gently in return. "You don't need to thank me," he whispered. Anyone would have done the same thing. But even as he said it, Samuel knew it wasn't true. Not everyone would have given up their most precious possession to help a stranger. Not everyone would have spent 3 days caring for someone they had never met before. And not everyone would have opened their heart to someone so different from themselves. As the night deepened, the girl's breathing became more labored. Samuel's parents came to sit with them, understanding that these might be her final hours. They didn't want her to die alone, and they wanted Samuel to know that they supported what he had done, even if they couldn't predict what consequences it might bring. The girl seemed to sense their presence, and for one last moment her eyes opened and looked at each of them in turn. It was as if she was memorizing their faces, taking the image of their kindness with her wherever she was going. Then, with a peaceful sigh that seemed too gentle for someone so young, she closed her eyes for the final time. The Henderson family spent the rest of that night in quiet mourning for a child they had known for only 3 days, but who had touched their hearts deeply. Samuel refused to leave her side even in death. He sat next to her small form, still wrapped in his grandmother's blanket, and wondered about her life. What had her favorite games been? Did she have brothers and sisters? Had her mother sung lullabies to her like his own mother had done for him? As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, Thomas made a difficult decision. They needed to prepare the girl's body properly, with the same respect they would want for their own daughter. Mary gathered their best white cloth while Thomas began working on a simple wooden box. They had no idea what burial customs her people followed, but they would do their best to honor her with dignity. Samuel watched as his parents gently prepared the girl for burial. They left his grandmother's blanket wrapped around her, understanding without being told that it belonged with her now. The intricate patterns seemed even more beautiful somehow, as if they had been meant for this moment all along. Samuel touched the blanket one last time, whispering a quiet goodbye to both his grandmother's memory and the little girl who had briefly shared their lives. It was while they were working that Elizabeth, Samuel's younger sister, came running toward the barn, with panic in her eyes. She had been looking out their cabin window when she spotted something that made her heart race with fear. In the distance, moving across the snowy plains like dark shadows, were riders. "Lots of riders, Papa," Elizabeth called out, her voice high with anxiety. "There are men coming, lots of them." Thomas immediately stopped what he was doing and climbed up into the barn's loft, where there was a small window that gave him a view of the surrounding area. What he saw made his blood run cold. Spread across the horizon were more Native American warriors than he had ever seen in one place. They were still far away, but they were definitely heading toward the Henderson homestead. Samuel scrambled up beside his father to see for himself. Even from a distance, he could tell that these weren't peaceful travelers. The riders moved with purpose, their horses arranged in formation like an army preparing for battle. Samuel counted as many as he could see, losing track after 50, then 60, then more. His heart began to pound as he realized there might be hundreds of them. What do they want? Samuel asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Thomas climbed down from the loft with a grim expression. I think they're looking for her, he said, nodding toward the girl's body. And when they find her here, with us ... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood what it might look like to the approaching warriors. A Native American girl, dead in the barn of white settlers. No matter how innocent the truth was, the situation could easily be misunderstood in the worst possible way. Mary quickly gathered Elizabeth and began making preparations to barricade themselves in the cabin if necessary. But Samuel had a different idea. We should tell them what really happened, he said. We should explain that we tried to help her. Son, Thomas said gently, they might not want to listen to explanations. They might be too angry, too hurt by finding her here. As the morning progressed, the riders drew closer and the Henderson family could see them more clearly. These were indeed warriors, many of them painted for battle, carrying weapons and riding with the fluid grace of people who had spent their entire lives on horseback. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, Samuel found himself thinking about all the times his father had told him that the Lakota people were just neighbors who deserved respect. But looking at the approaching force, it was hard not to feel afraid. These weren't the occasional peaceful visitors who had stopped by their homestead before. These were warriors who clearly meant business, and that business probably involved the dead girl in their barn. By midday, the full scope of the approaching force became clear. There weren't just 50 or 60 riders, there were hundreds. Samuel tried counting again and again, but kept losing track as more warriors appeared. Over the rolling hills, the sight was unlike anything any of them had ever imagined. It looked like every fighting man from multiple villages had joined together for this search. The warriors began spreading out as they approached, surrounding the Henderson homestead in a wide circle that stretched as far as the eye could see. They moved with the coordination of people who had done this before, cutting off any possible escape routes. Within an hour, the Henderson family found themselves completely encircled by what Samuel estimated to be nearly 700 Native American warriors. The family gathered in their small cabin, watching through the windows as the circle of riders slowly tightened around their home. The warriors didn't charge or make threatening gestures, but their mere presence was intimidating enough. Samuel could see the paint on their faces, the feathers in their hair, and the weapons they carried. These were serious men on a serious mission. They're not attacking, Thomas observed, trying to sound calmer than he felt. They're just dotting. Waiting for what? Mary asked, holding Elizabeth close before anyone could answer. A small group of warriors separated from the main force and began riding slowly toward the cabin. At their head was a man who was clearly a leader, his bearing, his decorated horse, and the way the other warriors deferred to him all marked him as someone of great importance. Samuel guessed this might be a chief, and probably the chief of the girl they had tried to help. As the small group approached, Samuel made a decision that surprised even himself. I'm going out there, he announced. Absolutely not, his mother said immediately. Son, that's too dangerous, Thomas agreed, but Samuel was already moving toward the door. She was my responsibility, he said firmly. I found her, I took care of her, and I made the choice to give her my blanket. If someone needs to explain what happened, it should be me. Thomas caught his son's arm. Samuel, these men are grieving. They might not think clearly about what they're doing. Samuel looked at his father with an expression that seemed far older than his 12 years. Papa, you always taught me that people deserve respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. You said the Lakota people are our neighbors. Well, now our neighbors are hurting and they need to know the truth. Before anyone could stop him, Samuel opened the cabin door and stepped outside into the bitter cold. The approaching warriors immediately noticed him, and Samuel could feel hundreds of eyes focusing on his small figure. His heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst, but he forced himself to walk steadily toward the group of leaders. The warrior who appeared to be the chief raised his hand, and the entire group stopped their horses about 20 feet from Samuel. The man's face was painted with red and black designs, and his dark eyes held a mixture of grief and barely controlled anger. Samuel realized that this was probably the girl's father, and the thought made his stomach twist with sympathy and fear. For a long moment nobody moved or spoke. Samuel stood in the snow, a small boy facing an army of warriors with nothing but the truth to protect him. Around them, the circle of hundreds of mounted fighters waited to see what their leader would do. The wind whistled across the frozen plains, and Samuel could hear his own heart pounding in his ears as he prepared to face the consequences of his act of kindness. Samuel stood in the snow, his breath creating small clouds in the freezing air as he faced the mounted warriors. The chief's painted face showed no emotion, but his dark eyes seemed to look right through Samuel's soul. For what felt like forever, nobody moved or spoke. The only sounds were the wind whistling across the plains and the occasional snort from one of the horses. Finally, the chief raised his hand and spoke a few words in his native language. Immediately, several warriors dismounted and began walking toward the Henderson barn. Samuel's heart sank as he realized they were going to find the girl's body. And when they did, the situation could explode into violence in seconds. Samuel took a deep breath and did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He started walking toward the barn, gesturing for the warriors to follow him. If they were going to find her anyway, he wanted to be the one to show them what had happened. He wanted them to see that she had been cared for with respect and love. The chief barked out what sounded like an order, and the other warriors stopped in their tracks. Then, slowly, the chief himself dismounted from his horse. He was a tall, powerful man, and up close, Samuel could see the grief etched in the lines around his eyes. This was definitely the girl's father, and the pain of losing his daughter was written all over his face. Together, Samuel and the chief walked toward the barn, followed by a few other warriors who appeared to be elders or advisors. Samuel's parents watched from the cabin window, their hearts in their throats as they saw their young son leading a group of armed warriors toward the building where the girl's body lay. When they reached the barn, Samuel paused at the door and looked up at the chief. He wished desperately that he could speak the man's language, that he could explain everything that had happened. Instead, he simply opened the door and stepped inside, hoping that what the chief saw would tell the story. Better than words ever could, the scene inside the barn was exactly as they had left it. The girl's small body lay peacefully in the makeshift bed Samuel had created for her, still wrapped in his grandmother's beautiful blanket. Around her were the bowls that had held broth, the cloths they had used to cool her fever, and all the evidence of 3 days of careful, loving care. The chief stopped just inside the doorway, and Samuel heard him draw in a sharp breath. The man's eyes took in every detail, the careful way his daughter had been positioned, and the quality of the blanket that covered her, the clean cloths and the signs that someone had spent considerable time and effort trying to save her life. One of the elder warriors who had followed them inside began speaking rapidly in their language, pointing to various things around the makeshift sick room. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but the tone seemed to be one of surprise, as if the man was explaining to the chief that this wasn't what they had expected to find. Slowly, the chief approached his daughter's body. He knelt beside her and gently touched the blanket, his fingers tracing the same intricate patterns that the girl herself had touched just days before. Samuel watched as the powerful warrior's composure began to crack, and he saw tears forming in the man's eyes. It was then that something unexpected happened. From behind the group of men came an elderly woman, moving with the careful steps of one who was used to being respected and listened to. She was dressed in beautiful traditional clothing, and her long gray hair was braided with beads and feathers. Samuel guessed that she might be the girl's grandmother or perhaps a medicine woman. The elderly woman approached the girl's body and began examining everything with the careful attention of someone who understood the signs of illness and care. She looked at the girl's peaceful expression, felt the quality of the blanket, and studied the items that had been used to try to help her. Then she began speaking to the chief in a firm, steady voice. Samuel couldn't understand her words, but her tone was unmistakable. She was explaining something important, and whatever she was saying seemed to be changing the chief's understanding of the situation. The woman gestured toward Samuel several times, and each time she did, the chief's expression shifted slightly. After several minutes of intense conversation between the woman and the chief, one of the younger warriors stepped forward. To Samuel's amazement, this man spoke English, though with a heavy accent. "My grandmother asks about the blanket," the translator said, looking at Samuel with curiosity rather than hostility. "She says this is not a blanket for keeping warm. This is a blanket made with love, with many days of work. She asks why you give such a thing to a stranger." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "It was my grandmother's," he said simply. "She made it for me before she died, but the girl was cold and sick, and she needed it more than I did." The translator spoke to the elderly woman, who listened intently and then asked another question. "She wants to know what you did to care for the sick girl." Samuel began explaining everything he could remember, how he had found her nearly frozen in the snow, how he had created a warm shelter for her in the barn, how his family had tried to give her food and water, and how he had stayed with her day and night to make sure she wasn't alone. As he spoke, he could see the translator's expression changing from suspicion to something that looked like respect. The elderly woman listened to the translation, and then approached Samuel directly. She looked him up and down, studying his face, with the intensity of someone who was used to reading people's hearts. Then she did something that shocked everyone present. She reached out and gently touched Samuel's cheek, the way a grandmother might touch a beloved grandchild. She spoke again, this time at length, and Samuel could see that her words were having a profound effect on all the warriors who were listening. The chief's face, which had been frozen in grief and anger, began to soften. Some of the other warriors actually lowered their weapons. "My grandmother says you have the heart of our people," the translator explained. "She says the Great Spirit sent you to make sure her granddaughter did not die alone and uncared for. She says you gave the most precious thing you own to comfort a dying child, and this is the action of someone with a pure heart." Samuel felt tears running down his cheeks as he realized what the woman was saying. She understood. Somehow this wise grandmother had looked at the evidence and seen the truth of what had happened. The chief stood up slowly and looked at Samuel for a long moment. Then he placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder and spoke a few words that the translator quickly repeated. "He says you are no longer a stranger to our people. He says you are a son of our tribe, and you will always be welcome among us. He says the blanket should stay with his daughter because it was given with love, and love is the most powerful medicine of all." What happened next was something Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. The chief raised his voice and called out to all the warriors who surrounded the homestead. His words carried across the frozen landscape, and Samuel watched as hundreds of weapons were lowered and put away. The circle of mounted fighters didn't disappear, but their posture changed completely. Instead of preparing for battle, they began preparing for ceremony. The warriors dismounted and gathered in groups, and Samuel realized that instead of seeking revenge, they were going to honor both their lost daughter and the family who had cared for her in her final moments.